Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Arctic Connections, where we bring the Arctic to people and people to the Arctic. Today, we're going to talk about diplomacy, specifically Arctic diplomacy, and with a diplomat, an Arctic diplomat perhaps, but a diplomat, a senior foreign service officer. That's correct, senior foreign service officer, right?
Foreign service officer. I'm not quite promoted to senior level, so I don't want to take that credit.
I like to be aspirational, so
I like that.
Foreign Service Officer, hopefully soon to be Senior Foreign Service Officer Joel Kopp, who is the National and Arctic Interest Chair at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. We'll introduce you in a moment, Joel, but I want to set the table real briefly here. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
2024. Calendar has flipped. 23 is behind us. Some might say thanks. I think a lot of people are saying no thanks, seeing that 24 will be an election year again, and that might steal some of the headlines. Meanwhile, the more things that change, the more things stay the same. War persists in Europe. War returns, or perhaps has never left, the Middle East. The same tensions that existed in the South China Sea and throughout the Indo-Pacific region remain, perhaps have been enhanced. Others might argue they've not gone that direction. Needless to say, there's a lot going around the world, including the Arctic, which is part of the reason we want to sit down and chat today, to find out how the U.S. State Department does diplomacy, does Arctic diplomacy, how that diplomacy fits in here at the Ted Stevens Center, being a DoD center, but of course addresses security in a lot of different manners. So, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here.
It's good to have you.
Yeah.
So, Joel, you've had an accomplished career as a diplomat with a 20-year track record.
22 now.
22. Successfully advancing U.S. national and economic security priorities through innovative, effective engagement with government, business, civil society, from Africa to Asia to Latin America to here in the United States in Washington, D.C., and now in Anchorage. Quite impressive. In fact, I think when you first demonstrated interest in coming to the Stevens Center, you were calling from Monrovia.
That's correct. My interview occurred in the front office of the embassy because I was acting deputy chief of mission at the time.
Yeah. And some might wonder why someone serving in Monrovia would have an interest in the Arctic, but we would later come to find out that really you were here before you were there, granted, before being many years before, but you might say that your career, not necessarily in the Foreign Service, but your career started here in Alaska.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yep. Yeah, that's true.
Just real briefly, what were you doing before you joined the Foreign Service? Because I think it's important to think, all right, I'm working, I'm living in Alaska, I'm going to join the Foreign Service, and then 22 years go by, and then you come back to Alaska, still in the Foreign Service, but now informed by all those years of experience to, in some ways, help develop infrastructure at a center that addresses some of the things that you were doing before you even got into the Foreign Service.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really interesting arc that I've been on, and I can't say that I planned it. It just ended up that way. You know, I spent the first 5 years of my life in a Yupik village where my dad was a school teacher on Lake Iliamna. Then grew up in the Kenai Peninsula, then went to college at UAA right here in town, and then that's where I met my wife. And then for about 10 years, did a few different kinds of jobs. For the biggest chunk of that, I was a project manager at the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council in Valdez. So from there, I had really picked up some of the Arctic policy experience that I was interested in. But from there, I then went to grad school at the University of Washington and studied public policy in the maritime context. It was called a Master of Marine Affairs degree. But then from grad school, I ended up going into the Foreign Service, and not in a planned way. It wasn't something I intended to do. So ended up coming from, sort of rural Alaska roots through grad school, took the Foreign Service exam, went through that whole process, and ended up joining the Foreign Service.
When you joined the Foreign Service, did you have any sort of inkling that you might return to Alaska as part of the Foreign Service?
Oh, absolutely not. I thought I was done with Alaska. It was my home. Emotionally, it was always my home. I wanted to come back. All my family was still here. And we did come back frequently, but I never imagined that I would live here again, certainly not as a diplomat. There are no Foreign Service officer positions in Alaska. There are no diplomatic positions in Alaska. And it was the Ted Stevens Center that changed that by negotiating with the State Department to have a position created, one of only a few. I think there's only 2 other DoD regional centers that have a Foreign Service officer assigned to them. So it was an opportunity that just came out of the blue. When I saw it on the vacancy list, I was like, "What is that?" That is really interesting. So yeah, I definitely jumped at the chance.
Well, I want to get more to that in a little bit, both specifically how you ended up here personally, but how a Foreign Service officer ends up here in the U.S. Arctic or near the U.S. Arctic in Alaska, and specifically the Ted Stevens Center, and really to zoom beyond that, back from that, how the U.S. State Department handles Arctic. But before we get there, I want to look at the big picture. As we head into 24, in listening to the headlines, reading the headlines, listening to the reports, some might say that there's turmoil, global turmoil. You're a Foreign Service officer that's served for 22 years all over the world. And sometimes it's easy to get focused on the immediacy of global crises. But if there's any profession that might understand this, it would be a Foreign Service officer who served in various places, oftentimes on the front lines of crises, some that garner international headlines, some that are more local. There's war in the Middle East. There's war in Europe. There's war in East Africa. There's conflicts many other places. There's plenty of issues to talk about, from food security to AI to governance. Is it hyperbole to say that we're at an inflection point? From a seasoned diplomat's perspective, is the world on edge, or are we not as close to the edge as we might think?
I'm not sure what you mean by the edge, but I would say I wouldn't call it an inflection point. I would call it in a transitionary period, where the structures that have sort of dominated the international landscape over the last 50 years are being challenged and reimagined in different ways. And are they going to last in their current, iteration? Probably there will be some changes in some aspects. But on a bigger perspective, what we see is sort of the autocratic government worldview competing with a democratic government worldview. And sort of, obviously, we in the State Department are very forward-leaning on supporting democracy, and especially in young democracies around the world that are trying to have a responsibly run government that is responsive to its citizens. So in the State Department's perspective, we see this played out in sort of that, preserving democracy dynamic. That is the tension that we see, and that tension can give rise to some of the conflicts that we're seeing. We see that in Ukraine, we see that in Africa, we see it in a number of places.
So take me inside the State Department for a minute. A department similar to the Defense Department, in that day in and day out, there's things going on all over the world that might appear on headline, cable news. It might not. Quantifiably, if you could quantify it, is there more chaos, turmoil going on now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or is it kind of the same with just a few that are flaming a little bit louder? And I ask because in the United States, sometimes we can feel a little more isolated from incidents that are playing out in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America, and specifically what we do in the Arctic sphere. Things have been relatively stable for quite some time. So it's hard to necessarily have a comparable measure of where we're at.
Yeah. It is a question of perspective. I mean, I would say there probably are more larger scale conflicts going on right now. I don't know if it's more conflicts. There's always going to be conflict. Even if we were at a time of relative global peace, let's say, it's often news media driven. So then the focus would be on the remaining conflict.
Yes.
So then you'd hear about what's going on in Yemen and these horrible things happening, and right now we're not hearing about Yemen because we got these larger scale things going on. So a lot of it is information availability, what we're exposed to, what we know about. There's a lot of conflicts going on that, just don't make it above the news media threshold. So we react to what we see in the news. And right now there is a lot of newsworthy, high-profile conflict going on.
And so I think it's an interesting way to transition a little bit to the Arctic, in that the Arctic has been a region of low intensity, no conflict or low conflict, or at least the risk of it historically and at present. That doesn't mean it's immune from conflict. But when there's conflicts arising elsewhere, or there's more of them, or the intensity of them are greater, the question arises, could conflict arise in the Arctic? And this past October at the Arctic Circle Assembly, the world's largest Arctic policy convening forum, the NATO chief said that we, and it has to speak NATO, must be prepared for conflict in the Arctic. Doesn't mean it's inevitable. But I'm wondering if that sort of language speaks to sort of what you're talking about, that if there wasn't conflicts going on in one place, we'd focus on another. Because they're always going to be happening somewhere. And when we talk about it happening or potentially happening in the Arctic, does that give life to the idea that it could? Or is it realistic to talk about it in that context, knowing that, as you said, there are larger or higher intensity conflicts playing out right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It is definitely an interesting time in the Arctic. So we talked about, we're sort of in a time of transition globally in a lot of ways, and that's also true in the Arctic. Two quick points on that. One is that the Arctic is seeing increasing competing agendas, primarily because of accessibility. So anytime you have greater access, you have greater opportunity for political competition and tension. Who owns what? Who gets to do what? And who doesn't get to do what? That's part of it. The other part of it is the biggest Arctic nation, Russia, is pulling harder and harder away from sort of the international rules-based order that creates tension across the Arctic Ocean. So all of the rest of the Arctic is now unified under NATO. But Russia clearly is not, and is pulling away from that rules-based order that NATO stands for. Sweden is not in NATO, but they don't have coastline on the Arctic Ocean, so I'm excluding them for the moment. But that is sort of the issue. You have greater accessibility, which leads to greater potential for political and resource conflict. And then you have Russia as a state actor sort of pulling away and creating tension with the rest of the Arctic nations.
Yeah. We hear often now that when talking about the Arctic in the context of global affairs, there are some clarifying points that are made. It's a governed region. Oftentimes it's a misnomer that it's an ungoverned gray zone by those who aren't necessarily as familiar. Well, maybe we even take a step back from that and just look at it geographically and say it's an ocean surrounded by land, not land surrounded by an ocean, as a typical continent might be. It's governed by rules, laws, and normed. Most, maybe not all, but most sovereignty issues are resolved. And because of those things, there is a framework, both policy and legally, that countries, I don't know what the right word is, should or need to follow. Can you explain to us a little bit from the State Department's perspective, maybe their role based on how you've been informed in your other roles, where if you look at our goals are for the U.S. goals for the Arctic region, one of which is to preserve the rules-based order in the Arctic. What does that actually mean, and why is that important?
Yeah. So I should start by saying I'm not in this capacity an official representative of the State Department. So I'm not representing them in my comments. I'm commenting based on my experience in the State Department, and you appreciate that distinction there between the two. Yeah. So the rules-based order is something that we have largely enjoyed because of the law of the sea and the agreement among the nations to in terms of governing the Arctic space, to apply those norms and standards to the Arctic region and to cooperate together to the Arctic Council. So you're right, it is a governed space. But like I mentioned earlier, it's also a more easily accessible space. Even though the Arctic nations have the governance structures in place, other nations can and do access for research, for transportation, for potentially energy production. And so it's those other actors that also have a right as international players, especially in the ungoverned donut hole in the middle of the Arctic Ocean that falls under the high seas regime of the UN Conventional Law of the Sea, that, again, the access brings tension, access brings greater knowledge, and with that knowledge becomes greater responsibility. Once you learn if we manage the watershed in this way, then it affects the Arctic in this way. Now that we know that, we have a responsibility to respond to that. And as a group of Arctic nations, we have a mutual sort of skin in the game. How do non-Arctic nations fit into that? When they don't have skin in the game per se, but they want to participate in the resource availability and the commercial opportunities that an increasingly open Arctic creates.
Yeah, it's within the Department of Defense or DoD worlds or MOD worlds, if we're speaking internationally. Some of the themes that come up when talking about the Arctic are fighting and winning war or battle, preparing for that, or oftentimes what we talk about deterrence in the high north, preventing some sort of conflict. But really what you're saying in preserving a rules-based order is before even that, is ensuring that the structure that governs the region remains strong enough and in place where we don't have to revert towards really the military mechanisms to preserve what it is that we want, we being the United States or similar stakeholders in the particular region. And I'm pointing this out because for a while it seemed, I think there was a perception that the Department of Defense maybe was in the lead in that particular region because there wasn't, say, dedicated offices within the State Department. Or maybe you can help us understand how the State Department does Arctic diplomacy.
Right.
And we can put that next to, being a regional center.
Right.
Within the Department of Defense, we got combatant commands broken out geographically, some functional commands, but, with geographic combatant commands, NORTHCOM, EUCOM, they each have their parts of the world. When you stop and think about it for a second, you say, well, does the State Department do it the same way? How do they do that? How do we do diplomacy globally? Can you explain that?
Yeah, right. Well, they say that any hot conflict, in a sense, is a failure of diplomacy. So obviously, military security remains the domain of the Department of Defense. But in the State Department, you're right that we have had this, this Arctic Council / Law of the Sea peaceful situation, and diplomacy has supported that. But the State Department, I guess, like the DoD and other government organizations, is divided by geographic bureaus and by functional bureaus. And in our case, we have several of those bureaus with equities in the Arctic. The Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau via Canada is very focused on the Arctic. So is EUR, our European Bureau. But also so is our Ocean Environment and Science Bureau, which has an Office of Polar and Ocean Affairs, very involved in our recent extended continental shelf claim, by the way. So you have these various offices with equities, Political Military Bureau, several others that I haven't mentioned, that have this set of equities, individual set of equities, overlapping equities, but also separate and priorities in the Arctic. So that is what led to the situation like the State Department typically does when you have an increasingly important cross-cutting issue. You have like a czar or a senior advisor or someone put in that role to sort of lasso all of those interests and coordinate and bring them together. So the State Department created that position in a senior advisor role, which lasted for a number of years. And then as Arctic issues became increasingly important, that rose to the level of creating an ambassadorial position and then nominating Dr. Mike Sprague for that position. But that was the idea, is we have all these different bureaus with equities, with interests, with priorities in the Arctic, but who really coordinates that? The Secretary of State can't play that role, except if we're at a very high level. You need some more at the functional level who can do that. So that it made sense that we would have an ambassadorial position assigned to that role.
If my memory serves me right, there was the special representative for the Arctic region that was created to coincide with the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council. I believe that was Admiral Papp, who served in that capacity, and then that I guess you could say maybe went dormant for a little while, didn't necessarily go away entirely, but went unfilled. And then there was the coordinator for the Arctic region, and that was Jim DeHart.
Correct.
And then there was again maybe a pause in that, and it has subsequently now been elevated to maybe not use an official term for it, but brought to the level of an ambassador.
Right.
That would exist. Nominated and confirmed by the Senate. Previous positions were not confirmed by the Senate, if I can understand. And all three of those positions in some way provided some coordination of the Arctic interests within the State Department.
Right. And it was the creation of that position should also be mentioned and understood in the context of all the other Arctic initiatives that the State Department and the rest of the USG were undertaking, not the least of which was reopening our consulate in Nuuk,
right,
and creation of a new American presence post in Tromsø. And obviously there were other positions. We have a new national Arctic strategy. We have my position here at the Ted Stevens Center. We have the creation of the Ted Stevens Center. So there are other elements within the government and within the State Department sending this same signal that the Arctic is increasingly important. Obviously, the creation of an ambassador position was a huge part of that. So it is, from a personal, professional standpoint, it is disappointing that hasn't been confirmed.
Yeah. So just to recap, from a U.S. State Department Arctic standpoint, recently it's been the consulate opening in Nuuk, Greenland. I don't know if it was 2019 or 2020, but somewhat recently, and then very recently, an opening of the diplomatic presence post in Tromsø. At least the creation of the office that will soon be home to the Arctic ambassador. Of course, the Stevens Center and its work with, and obviously your presence at, and future Foreign Service officers at the Ted Stevens Center, just representing 4 specific actions that have been taken by the State Department to elevate our diplomatic posture when it comes to the Arctic, in addition to everything that existed before that, which maybe to some people wasn't as outwardly known, but existed for quite some time. You mentioned the senior Arctic official representing our interests at the Arctic Council and all the other functional areas and even political areas, whether that's binational, multinational, with Arctic countries or for Arctic issues. So perhaps more than the common eye might find in the State Department just sifting through how it handles Arctic, there's a lot there. And it's
there definitely is. And the extended continental shelf is the latest, not that was exclusively Arctic, but that there was a huge chunk, multiple chunks of Arctic territory, Arctic region, that were included in that. So it really added a strong Arctic dimension to the extended continental shelf claim as another example of how our government is increasingly focused on the Arctic.
Absolutely. You mentioned your role here at the Stevens Center, so I want to get personal for a little bit. Let's talk about you and your role here at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. You're an associate director for the Arctic Chairs Program. I know what this is. I've been here for a little while, but maybe you can explain it in your terms, what your role is as a Foreign Service officer at a Department of Defense regional center.
Yeah. So, like other DoD regional centers, the Ted Stevens Center is explicitly and necessarily very internationally focused. That is particularly true in our case in the sense that we have a fairly clear set of Arctic allies and partners with whom we want to work on a regular, steady, very close-knit, cooperative, collaborative basis. How's that for a number of adjectives?
Sounds about right. Yeah.
The Ted Stevens Center, if it is going to be an effective center for regional studies, for the three divisions that we do, the executive education, the research and analysis, and engagement. It's not going to be just the Ted Stevens Centers doing that up here in Alaska. It's going to be the Arctic, the unified, allied Arctic partner community doing that. And so it follows from that logic that you would have, at least aspirationally, and this is like we're heading this direction, is to have representatives or chairs or secondments, we call them chairs, to the Ted Stevens Center from our Arctic allies and partners, militaries, governments, maybe even universities, to come participate with us in one or more of those three division areas. Because again, we are going to be more effective when we're not doing those things alone up here in Anchorage. When we have those partners, it's not just us going out and meeting with them and discussing with them in their corner of the world, but them coming here and for whatever time. Obviously everyone's bandwidth is kind of stretched thin, and not everyone has the personnel to contribute to this. But to have people here for 6 months, for a year, for 18 months, or whatever, for even on a virtual capacity with occasional visits, to be assigned in a way that they can contribute to specific, discrete aspects of those three mission areas of the Ted Stevens Center. It makes sense to me. It made sense to me when I heard about it 4 months into the job. It still makes sense to me. And we're still in the mode of getting our legal and procedural and processes in place before we can formally open the door and say, okay, come on in.
So just to get this straight, the Ted Stevens Center, it's a regional center, it's a DoD regional center falling under security cooperation. An important word there is cooperation. Cooperation specifically with partners and allies. And in this context, for our center, those partners and allies are primarily other Arctic countries. And so what you're saying is your role is to facilitate representation from other Arctic countries, whether that's in their ministries of defense, ministries of foreign affairs would be the two most likely candidates, I'd assume, to work at or maybe work with, depending on how it works out, the Ted Stevens Center on a maybe full-time, part-time basis in order to facilitate that sort of cooperation that we're looking to build within this region. Is that did I kind of paraphrase that correctly?
Correct, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to cooperate with someone whose entire portfolio is focused on what they need to do. It's another level to have some representative, let's say of Finland or Norway or Iceland, actually billeted, to the Ted Stevens Center. It's like, that is your job. You're going to go work at part-time or virtually part-time, physically part-time. You're going to go work at the Ted Stevens Center, and while there, you're going to do things. Let's say we have a Finnish representative. They're going to work on things that are of mutual interest, and there are a lot of areas of mutual interest between the U.S., the Ted Stevens Center, and Finland, where they could be instructors, they could be researchers, they could do analysis, they could help formulate policy decisions, and contribute in a way that they couldn't in their previous position, and sort of elevate the level of cooperation that we can have with them.
Yeah, there's certainly some value in as the saying goes, just simply showing up or being present for something. And
right.
A little while back, this past fall, the Ted Stevens Center hosted the Arctic Defense Attaché Field Seminar, where we had the opportunity to bring representation from Arctic countries, their defense attachés that were at the time stationed in Washington, D.C., all the way up to Utqiagvik, to spend roughly 2-3 days in the U.S. Arctic. And some of the anecdotal feedback from that was that it was simply eye-opening, or one of the most valuable experiences that those diplomats, because I could call them that as attachés,
right.
Walked away with, was seeing the Arctic from a North American and from a U.S. perspective.
Right.
And seeing that the majority, not all, but the majority of the U.S. partners and allies in the Arctic are European, it seems to me that a lot of them would benefit from spending some time here, not only sharing what they have learned, what they know from their perspective, their national perspectives, their regional perspectives, but also from learning what happens in this corner of the Arctic. Would you think there's value in that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Alaska is the reason why the United States is an Arctic nation. So it was very important that the Ted Stevens Center be in Alaska. I mean, it would be very strange if the Ted Stevens Center was in Washington, D.C. Obviously there was a strong logic to having the Ted Stevens Center here, but the same logic then applies to, if this is the part of the world, and as an Alaskan, I like to reiterate, Alaska is not just a state; it is a global region that spans from Canada into Asia and into the Arctic Circle. There's no substitute for being present. In the government, we say personnel is policy.
Yeah.
So, getting back, that's why it was important to have an ambassador role, because that was a way to signal this is important. We want to assign greater authority to personnel in this area. So the same thing applies. If personnel is policy, then having other allied partners and governments carve out, personnel or part of a personnel's time and have them be here is the same sort of expression of commitment and importance of the Arctic and importance of Arctic cooperation and collaboration that we have shown in, creation of the Arctic ambassador position, or creation of this center, for instance, and then assigning over 40 billeted positions here.
Yeah.
It's that same sort of personnel as policy, and presence really matters.
Yeah. So what can we look, just briefly here, a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, you're in charge of the Arctic Chairs program, you're creating it, so hopefully sometime on down the line you look back and say, wow, we started from here and now we got to here.
Right.
What are you trying to get done in the short term, and where maybe would we expect to get to in the long term, just to close the conversation?
Right, great question. So in my year here, my goal is to stand up the program, to have the legal authorities in place, to have the equipment in place, the processes in place, the clearances in place, to make sure our internal ducks are in a row, and then to have people either here or online to come here as chairs before I leave. That would be my goal. I'd be very happy if we have like some incoming chairs by the time I'm outgoing.
Yeah. Well, we'll look forward to what's to come in regards to the Arctic Chairs program. I'm going to switch gears here real quick.
Yeah.
We're going to get even more personal. That was professionally personal, but this is personal.
Okay.
Quick hits. You get 1 or 2 words to answer these questions.
Uh-oh. Okay.
We'll start off easy, all right? Just to get you in the mindset. Favorite color?
Favorite
color?
Color. I'm going to go with green.
Green. Okay. Your favorite assignment in the Foreign Service?
Ooh. Foreign assistance coordinator in Pakistan.
Why?
Hugely impactful. We had, when I was there, we had over $1 billion in foreign assistance programs. And my job, although it sounds counterintuitive, my job following a director from the National Security Council was to coordinate the dramatic reduction of the size of that program, because we had identified areas where it just wasn't working out in the way that we had hoped.
What year was this?
This was from 2018 to 2020. Yeah. So we were able to focus on the things that we had been successful at and highlight those and cut away things that had been less than successful for a wide number of reasons, some of them politically sensitive.
Okay, so your least favorite assignment in the Foreign Service?
Ooh, it's interesting. I guess my least favorite job was sitting down as a consular officer in my very first assignment in Monterrey, Mexico, and adjudicating 140, 150 visa applications every single day. It was as close to blue collar work as diplomats get. It's like you punch in, you sit down, you interview. However, loved Mexico, loved living there. On a personal level, it was fantastic. So did I like the assignment? Yeah. Did I like the job? That job was tough.
That was your first job in the Foreign Service?
That was my very first job in the Foreign Service.
Did you think about leaving?
Oh, definitely not. No, it was, me and 14 other interviewing officers. We were a club. Several of them had joined the Foreign Service at the same time as me. We had gone through training together, learned Spanish together. So, we had some good esprit de corps down there, even though it was a tough job.
Right. So this is more than one or two words, but can you sequentially list off your assignments in the Foreign Service by location?
Yeah. Okay. So it started in Washington with orientation, consular training, Spanish training. And then it was Monterrey, Mexico for 2.5 years. And then it was back to Washington for multiple assignments. That ended up being 6 years in total, including language training, which for my next assignment was Jakarta, Indonesia. So I learned Indonesian and then went to Indonesia for 3 years. And then Indonesia to Nigeria, largest country in Africa, largest economy in Africa, 4 years. 2 years in Pakistan, 3 years in Liberia, and here.
What was the worst move?
The worst move. I would say the worst move was not an international move. It was moving between housing assignments in Abuja, Nigeria, from one diplomatic compound to another. It was, they didn't hire the same level of movers, and so my stuff kind of got beat up in that one.
All right, so what's your favorite spot in Alaska? Your favorite restaurant to go to? Your favorite bar?
Oh wow! Oh my gosh! I'm gonna have to say, even though I haven't been there very much, the Saltery in Halibut Cove is a really special place. But that's just because Halibut Cove is a very special place. Yes, so if you ever get across, Kachemak Bay, Halibut Cove on a beautiful day is like going into a storybook, and then you walk up the little boardwalk, and the Saltery restaurant is just a beautiful.
You see, we ask the questions because when people travel to Alaska, they say, "Okay, where should I go? Where should I?" And then first off, you look at Alaska, and it's huge, of course. But then if you just focus in on Anchorage, it's huge too.
Right.
Where do you go? Where do you direct them to? And each time we find out a little bit more. Different places to go. Halibut Cove is great. How about here in Anchorage, though? Where do you like to go?
I like 49 State Brewing. I think it's a really nice spot. I like Double Muskie down in Girdwood, although I admit I haven't been there in a while. What else do we like? Rustic Goat is good. I'm drawing a blank on other places, but I will say, just to summarize that component, I lived here, as I mentioned, back in college days. This was the 80s. And I will say that the gastronomical scene in Anchorage from the 80s to today is much better today. As a student, I was relying on, late night Denny's, things like that. We got some really good options here now.
Well, I was going to ask a couple more questions, but I think this is actually a little more relevant because I'd like to kind of start or finish where where we began, and that's you were in Alaska, left Alaska, you're back to Alaska. You were not in the State Department, you joined the State Department. You're still in the State Department, but you're not technically, I guess, because it is a senior foreign service, soon to be a senior foreign service. But you are senior in the fact that you've spent a lot of time. You could maybe qualify it that way. In one respect, Alaska, being what makes the U.S. an Arctic country, has undergone a lot of transitions over the years. Anchorage itself, from the 80s to the 90s, into today. At the same time, the State Department has evolved. You've evolved. I'm just wondering if there's not some interesting intersections there. I mean, you started a career up here, left that career, become a diplomat, and now you're back up here. How is Alaska? How do you look at it differently now? Maybe the U.S. Arctic, having gone through all this training, all these global perspectives, from Mexico to Indonesia to Pakistan to Liberia, through Washington, D.C. a number of times, all that policy work, multiple administrations, different leaderships, and now you're back here kind of where it all started. Certainly you might not look at it the same, but how is it different?
So, yeah, just in that background component, I think it's interesting to note that although it is highly unusual for someone from my rural Alaska background to become a diplomat, I found it really balances the experiences I had as a diplomat. It probably influenced I preferred developing countries to developed countries in terms of my assignments. And, in some ways, Alaska, and particularly the rural part of Alaska, is sort of a developing country. And so I felt probably more at home walking through an African village or an Indonesian village than your average diplomat, unless they happen to be USAID, and familiar with that. Just because there was something about that, very remote, transportation limited, restricted, economically underdeveloped environment that was familiar to me. It's like that. I know what these people are dealing with, and so some of those that level of familiarity was I think useful in a way to sort of understand kind of the countries that I was dealing with. So it wasn't normal or natural for someone who grew up at least part in rural Alaska to end up in the Foreign Service. I think it was good sort of training for a lot of what we do. Secondly, I think as an Alaskan, the fact that we now have something in Alaska we never had before in the Ted Stevens Center, which is Arctic Alaska-based diplomacy. When I grew up in Alaska, 70s and 80s, Alaska and diplomacy did not go together. You didn't understand those terms in the same sentence. The beauty of the Ted Stevens Center is it now makes Alaska a center for Arctic diplomacy. And that is really the reason that I, as an Alaskan diplomat, are here, because that is a really new, novel, and a great thing for Alaska. That now it's not just Washington, D.C. based diplomacy about the Arctic and other issues. We actually have Alaska-focused diplomacy being run out of Alaska.
Yeah. Which is really a sign of the direction the center is going, both internationally, as we talked about, from our international partners and allies, and the objective that the center has as part of security cooperation, but also locally here, in working with the partners that we have in the state of Alaska, really kind of where you were 20 some odd years ago, back out there in rural Alaska.
We didn't even talk about commercial fishing either.
We haven't even talked about that. We could certainly get into it. I want to give an opportunity, though, to those who are listening to ask some questions, maybe offer some of their insights here. So we'll transition to the question and answer segment here. Defer to my colleagues here in studio for any questions.
All right, we'll talk about commercial fishing.
Yeah, I do have a question about it. A couple weeks ago, I had an opportunity to provide a briefing to a group within the Pentagon focused on environmental security. And one of the things I tried to convey to that audience that's addressing this issue is why a regional center would be interested in not specifically commercial fishing, but fisheries in general. And I showed a map during that briefing that overlaid combatant commands, that typical DoD map you see with the perfectly straight lines where NORTHCOM ends, where EUCOM begins, where INDOPACOM, all the world demarcated by U.S. Department of Defense combatant commands.
Yep.
Adjacent to that was a map of two different fish species. I think it was cod and one of the species of salmon. And perfectly along the border between NORTHCOM and INDOPACOM, which is essentially the international date line, the fish, reflected in a certain shade, ceased to exist on the other side of the date line, as if the fish knew where the date line was. And of course, that wasn't the intention of the graphic, whoever created it, but it was just, it ended where we knew the fish were, because once they crossed that, it was outside an exclusive economic zone, or it was beyond an area in which the U.S. fisheries would be fishing. But the other story behind that is, well, do we really know where the species are? And I think that's where the security element of fisheries comes into conversation. And then the economic side of it is the commercial fisheries side of it. Where are these species going? If I'm going out, and I don't have the data in front of me, but if I can remember, I think it's about 20% of all, and maybe even more than that, natural seafood caught in the United States is from Alaska. And if that starts to decline, that's a big economic difference. It's a big economic impact, not to mention where are we going to get it and how are we going to replace that? Yeah. You started in the commercial fishing enterprise. Yeah. Maybe you're someone who can help us connect both sides of this, the commercial fishing enterprise, seafood, environmental security, and what a regional center does here to try to highlight the issue, approach the issue, and then connect with somebody who's on the other end of it. You're essentially on the diplomatic or the security side of it, and on one side you're on the commercial economic side of it.
Yeah. Well, we talked at the beginning about how transition implies instability. We talked about that on the global level, but the Arctic is in transition. And so the Arctic security issue there is a transitioning Arctic is more susceptible to insecurity, and fisheries could be a part of that. If you have an entire culture or way of life that depends on X fish species, migrating up Y and Z rivers, and suddenly that isn't happening anymore, you're talking about social stress, you're talking about cultural stress in a way that maybe hasn't existed in recent or long memory. And so if you have cultures and societies that are in greater turmoil, stress, and tension because the Arctic is transitioning, that could lend eventually to that could influence, let's say, the level of security in the Arctic region. So yeah, as a fisherman, my parents were school teachers, so it was natural that we would go out and fish. But we had the advantage of not being exclusively dependent on what we caught every summer, whereas a lot of people were. And if they didn't catch what they needed to live on or needed to sell to survive for the year, it was a huge problem. So how those fisheries are managed, not only by us, by our Arctic neighbors, really, really is important for a broader Arctic security world.
And one of the questions we get asked sometimes is, why are you covering, you being the regional center, why are you covering issues that aren't necessarily obviously, maybe not directly, it's not the right word, but obviously connected to defense. When I say defense, oftentimes people think radars and aircraft.
Missiles.
Exactly. I think what you're highlighting is we're a Department of Defense center focused on security.
Yeah.
In some of these issues, fisheries, knowing where these species are, is a security. It's a human security issue, it's a food security issue, which then falls directly within the sort of the remit of a center. What is the problem? How will this drive stability or instability, whether that's economic stability, whether that's governance, governance of the fisheries themselves or governance of the people as well. Maybe not specifically in Alaska, but it could be specifically in Alaska. So it's a really interesting intersection. I'm told that we have a question. What advice would you have for future Foreign Service officers?
Yeah. Boy, it would
not for current ones, I guess.
for future ones.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know whether that's advice how to get into to the Foreign Service or whether it's advice of, what should I do when I'm in the Foreign Service? I'm going to assume it's the latter. And I would say, the assignment process is such a big part of the Foreign Service life that, you should pursue assignments that you want, not necessarily those that you think will help you get promoted or get the assignments that you want. What a Foreign Service officer really does is inform, influence, and implement foreign policy. So my advice, second piece of advice would be to make sure you're comfortable working in a role where you're not necessarily forming foreign policy, where you're okay being the guy out there just informing, influencing, if you're lucky, and implementing foreign policy that you may or may not be in complete agreement with. You have to understand that will be your role.
Joel, I'm curious what advice you might have for someone like yourself 20 some odd years ago who was living in rural Alaska, who might be interested in joining the Foreign Service, or really anybody who's living in the U.S. Arctic, in Alaska. If they wanted to join the Foreign Service, I think if I could make an assumption, I think we probably need more people with your background or more people from rural Alaska representing our national interests internationally, informed by the experiences that can be garnered in places like rural Alaska.
Right. I agree. I would love to see more Native American diplomats. I mean, I can't remember meeting one. I've met other people who are from Alaska or who have lived in Alaska at one time or another. I'm the only one that I know that was born and raised in Alaska, but there may be others. But yeah, I would say the hiring process for the Foreign Service is pretty open. If you have any sort of foreign or policy experience, it helps. But it's a demanding process, but it's open. We have anything from former lawyers to former pastors to former blue-collar workers, all who have found their way into the Foreign Service because it's an open process. Everyone goes through the same hiring mechanisms. It's pretty intensive. There's a written portion, there's an oral portion. But I would love to see more Alaskans apply because that means we'll eventually get a few more in the system.
Perfect. Do we have another question? Well, Joel, we've had you on for about 55 minutes. We don't need to keep you any longer, but I'm wondering if you have any parting thoughts here to pass along, any wisdom to our audience, to other folks at the center. Your tenure at the Stevens Center is short. It's only a year. We're well into that year. I think you'll be switching out this summer. Is that right?
Fall-ish, yeah.
Fall-ish. Certainly have contributed in many ways already beyond the scope of what you originally came for, which was to stand up the Arctic Chairs program, which you've talked about. You've been an advisor at times to not just me, but to the whole center, to the director, and all the plethora of international engagements that we've done from Norway to Sweden to Finland to Iceland to a number of locations. Is there anything that has surprised you upon coming here? Is it what you thought it would be, in good ways and bad, perhaps, and maybe offer a little bit of sort of this is what a day in the life is like at the Stevens Center? And
I was surprised by the low toilets and the cubbies. I wasn't expecting that. But no, on a more serious level, I guess I have come to appreciate even more the relationship and the importance of the relationship between the State Department and the Ted Stevens Center. Like we talked about earlier, that what the Ted Stevens Center does is explicitly and necessarily very internationally focused. I think the Ted Stevens Center's job would be a lot harder if they didn't have an umbilical cord to the State Department. So I really enjoy playing that role in making sure that as both one foot in the State Department and one foot in the Ted Stevens Center, I can talk to both audiences, explain to them in their respective languages about what's going on, and then help them implement together and not step on each other's toes, and instead be supportive of each other when we're both sort of out doing what we do in terms of Arctic diplomacy.
Yeah. Joel, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure
Thanks for having me on.
Working with you. It's a pleasure to have you on, and looking forward to hearing about where the Arctic Chairs program goes from here, and then looking back upon all the progress that you made and your subsequent people in your position will make upon that. So
Yeah.
that's all the time we have for today on Arctic Connections. Until next time, we're signing out.
Thank you.
All right.